my dear students. Today we are going to learn a very interesting and funny poem called The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll. This poem uses a lot of imagination and shows us strange and magical things like the sun shining at night and the moon getting angry. As we read each stanza, we will understand the meaning in simple words and enjoy the story of the walrus and the carpenter on beach. First stanza, let me give explanation for this. The poet says the sun is shining brightly on the sea and making the waves look smooth. But the funny thing is, it's actually night time. This means the poet is using imagination to create a magical and silly picture. Now let's move on to the second stanza. Let me give explanation for this. Here the moon is upset because the sun is shining at night. Moon feels the sun should not be there after daytime is over. Moon even says it is rude, as if the sun is spoiling her nighttime fun. The poet uses imagination to make the moon talk like a person. Now let's move on to the third stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The poet describes the setting in a very simple way. The sea is completely wet and the sand is very dry, and the sky is totally clear with no clouds at all. There are also no birds flying because there are no birds in the sky. The poet wants us to imagine a quiet, empty beach with nothing moving except the water. Now let's move on to the fourth stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The walrus and the carpenter are walking together on the beach. When they look around, they see a huge amount of sand everywhere. They start crying, not because they are sad, but because they feel there is too much sand. They say that if the sand could be cleaned away, the place would look wonderful. This shows their funny and unusual way of thinking. Now let's move on to the fifth stanza. Let me give explanation for this. In this stanza, the walrus says that even if 7 maids used 7 mops and cleaned the beach for 6 months, they still would not be able to finish the job. And then the carpenter replies, I doubt it, which means he does not think it is possible. He even feels sad. This shows that there is too much sand and cleaning is impossible. Now let's move on to the sixth stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The walrus asks the oysters to come for a walk with him. He says it will be a pleasant walk and a pleasant talk along the salty seashore. Then he says they only need 4 oysters so that each of them can hold one hand. This stanza shows the walrus being very friendly and polite to convince the oysters to come. Now let's move on to seventh stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The eldest oyster looks at the walrus but does not speak. Instead, he winks his eye and shakes his heavy head. This is his way of saying that he does not want to leave the oyster bed. It shows that the eldest oyster is wise and careful, and he decides not to go with the walrus. Now let's move on to the eighth stanza. Let me give explanation for this. In this stanza, 4 young oysters quickly come forward because they are excited for the walk. The poet says their coats were brushed, their faces were washed, and their shoes were clean and neat. Then the poet adds something funny. The oyster don't even have feet. This stanza shows how eager and innocent the young oysters are. Now let's move on to the ninth stanza. Let me give explanation for this. In this stanza, more and more oysters begin to follow the first group. First, 4 come, then another 4, and soon many oysters are arriving quickly. They hop through the foamy waves and rush towards the shore. This stanza shows how excited and curious all the oysters are and how they all hurry to join the walk. Now let's move on to the 10th stanza. In this stanza, the walrus and the carpenter walks for about a mile and then sit down on a rock that is low enough for them to rest comfortably. All the little oysters line up in a neat row and wait for them. This shows that the oysters are obedient and ready to listen whatever the walrus and the carpenter says next. Now let's move on to 11th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. Here, the walrus says that time has come to talk about many different things. He mentions shoes, ships, sealing wax, cabbages, and kings. He even says funny things like why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs can fly. This stanza shows that the walrus is trying to distract the oysters by talking about silly and random topics. Now let's move on to the 12th stanza. Let me give an explanation for this. The oyster asks the walrus and the carpenter to wait for a moment before talking. They say they are out of breath and also a bit fat, so they need time to rest. The carpenter kindly says no hurry and the oysters thank them. This shows that the oysters feel tired but safe and the carpenter is pretending to be very polite. Now let's move on to the 13th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. Here, the walrus says that they need a loaf of bread and that pepper and vinegar will also be useful. Then he tells the oysters that if they are ready, they can begin to eat. This stanza shows the truth the walrus is planning to eat the oysters, not take them for a friendly walk. The oysters still do not realize they are in danger. Now let's move on to the 14th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. In this stanza, the oysters get scared and say, but not on us, because they realize the walrus wants to eat them. They turn a little blue with fear. They say it would be very sad and unfair after all the kindness they showed. But the walrus ignores their worry and tries to distract them by saying the night is beautiful and asking if they like the view. This shows he is avoiding the truth and trying to keep them calm. Now let's move on to the 15th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. In this stanza, the walrus is being polite and says, it was so kind of you to come. You are very nice. The carpenter, however, stays silent and only asks for another slice of food. He even complains a little that the walrus is hard of hearing and has to be asked twice. This stanza shows that the walrus and carpenter are pretending to be polite while really thinking about eating. Now let's move on to the 16th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The walrus says it feels a little sad to trick the oysters after making them walk so far and hurry so quickly. He pretends to feel sorry for them. The carpenter says nothing but complains that the butter on the bread is spread too thick. This stanza shows that the walrus and carpenter are pretending to care, but really they are focused on eating the oysters. Now let's move on to the 17th stanza. Let me give explanation for this. The walrus pretends to be very sad for the oysters. He says, I weep for you, and acts like he deeply sympathizes. He sorts out the largest oysters while holding a handkerchief and crying. This shows that the walrus is pretending to be kind and sad, but really he is planning to eat them. Now let's move on to the 18th stanza of the poem. Let me give explanation for this. The walrus continues sorting the oysters, pretending to be very sad. He acts like he feels sorry for them while really planning to eat them. The oysters still do not realize what is about to happen. This shows how tricky and deceptive the walrus is and how innocent are these oysters. Conclusion. The walrus and Carpenter tricked the oysters. The oysters thought they were going for a fun walk along the beach, but the walrus and the carpenter had other plans. The story is funny but also teaches us to be careful. Now let's see what is the moral of the story. Always be careful and think before trusting others. Not everyone who seems kind is really good. Use your brain, stay alert, and make smart choices. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fun learning videos. Until then, bye.